want to thank you, first of all, for inviting me to partner with you in this way. My name is Josh Taylor. I'm the Assistant Director of the Graham Office of Career Management at the Gatton School of Business and Economics at the University of Kentucky. And my good friend Mindy reached out to me not long ago. Mindy and I have been colleagues through the Kentucky Career Development Association for a number of years now. And told me that there would be an opportunity to speak to matters of LGBTQ equality in the workplace. And so this is a topic that is near and dear to my own heart for reasons, of course, that I'll explain. So it's my privilege and pleasure to be able to speak with you all this morning. Y'all, as I move forward in this talk, if there are any questions, by all means, take yourself off of the mic and we can have a really good conversation. But I'll go ahead and dive right on in. My clicker is now working. So I've told you a little bit about where I am now, but I want to give a little bit of my own backstory in terms of where I've been in my own life and how why this topic matters to me. So I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. You see a picture of me there in high school now many years ago. I'm a first generation college student. I come from a family, my dad's side of the family was born and raised in Atlanta, my mom's side of the family in southern Georgia. But I grew up there and attended the University of Georgia for college. I came out of the closet myself as a gay man when I was a freshman at the University of Georgia. Prior to that, was very much in the closet, if you will. I come from an evangelical Christian family, and without digressing into that too much, what I'll tell you is that my family had a very difficult time managing the reality of me as a gay person. I'll say more about that in just a moment. But I'll tell you that I majored at UGA in strategic communication and French linguistics. I went on to be a French interpreter for the Walt Disney Company for a number of years, then transitioned into a similar role for a global nonprofit called Rotary International, where I worked in the education division and was based at a university in Quebec, Canada called Laval University, and thus began my career in higher education. And I've been working at different institutions ever since, now, of course, at the University of Kentucky. Along the way, I have worked in a number of different work environments, some of which were more welcoming, more progressive than others. I'm sure I'll say more about that as we go on. I mentioned to you that I was born and raised in a Southern Baptist evangelical family in Georgia. My coming out was met with some extraordinary resistance from my family. Me walking you through that would be a whole separate topic. But if you need or want to talk about the way that I managed that and the way that my family managed that, I could and would say more in a different context. But I will simply say here, in 2013, I had the opportunity the book came out in 2012, I should say. In 2013, it was up for a Lambda Literary Award. But Dr. Bernadette Barton, who is a sociologist at Morehead State University in Eastern Kentucky, she wrote a book called The Extraordinary Lives of Bible Belt Gays. And I was one of the interview subjects, one of many that were a part of this book, talking about what our experiences were growing up in the Bible Belt, navigating our identities, in my case, as a gay man, and how I managed to come out and navigated that whole space, which for me and for everyone who was interviewed in the book, that whole period in our lives was fraught with a great deal of difficulty. I'll just say that. But I will tell you, working with Bernadette Barton and getting my story out and then being part of the book tour and really being able to explore some really valuable conversations about the intersection of sexuality, faith, religion, particularly in contexts of states here in the South, was a really transformative and important moment for me personally and professionally. So all of that to say, I am a trained career advisor. I am not a politician. I am not a sociologist. I'm not a lawyer, although I'm going to walk you through a lot of how the laws are shifting. You'll see I'll kind of take you through where we've been in the last several years. So I'm going to do my best to explain this to you from my own vantage point, but also speak to you now as a career advisor, because how and when and where does LGBTQ plus identity impact the workspace? Some of you here that are in this workshop today, you might be coming at this from the point of view of an ally, as a future boss one day. And how can you, as a hiring professional, help ensure workspaces that are inclusive and equitable? So those are some of the topics that we'll be talking about. So I'll begin with a little bit of context, showing you, what terms are we talking about? Where have things been historically? We'll need to take a look at where federal anti-discrimination laws are, what is covered and what is not covered. I'll walk you through then where we're at within the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and then circle back to have a little bit of a career conversation about how this impacts those of you right now as college students. And I'll give you a few resources that I recommend. And we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for some question and answer, if you like, towards the end. All right. So I want to begin with acknowledging a few things. Society in general assumes heterosexuality. What I mean by that is there are what I would call, heteronormative assumptions that a lot of folks might make, not everyone, but a lot of folks might make. So that means that when LGBTQ plus folks come out, I'll speak in my experience as a gay man, that's not a one and done process. I began coming out when I was 19. I'm now 40. And if I meet someone new who might not necessarily know me, they might see my wedding ring. I've had people assume that I have a wife when in fact I have a husband. What I'm simply trying to say is that you don't come out just one time. And so to bring this back to the workplace, when you join a new company, when you're interviewing, you might be starting the coming out process, if you will, all over again. I'll tell you how I have navigated that over the course of my own career and sort of the strategies that I use in my own life. But I want to simply tell you all, and you see here in this third bullet point, there is no right way. There's nothing that I'm going to tell you, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do. These are our topics, especially when it comes to personal identity, whether we're talking about sexual orientation or gender identity. I think we all know that we live in a world where sometimes these realities of identity can open us up to resistance, to misunderstanding, to even discrimination or harassment. And so how you navigate that is absolutely a personal choice. I want to lead by trying to make that as clear as possible. All right, so there's no right answer. Let's talk about then where we are right now with respect to workplace laws in terms of, could someone lose their job? Could they be fired over an issue of sexual orientation or gender identity? And the answer still is a little bit complicated, although for reasons I'll explain, a lot has changed just in the last 10 months. So let me tell you, let's go back to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Everything you see here as it is still written, these are the terms by which federal law protects workers against discrimination. So race, sex, pregnancy, religion, national origin, you see everything here. You'll notice that sexual orientation, gender identity, explicitly stated as such, is not there. Now, this is the federal law. State laws have to be in compliance with what they see here at the federal level, but then also can choose to add in additional things that are protected beyond what you see here at the federal level. States can add to that list. So for example, here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, smoking status is added as a protected issue within Kentucky. Sexual orientation and gender identity have not yet been added, for example, either at Kentucky or at the federal level. some states will have sexual orientation and gender identity as part of what's comprehensively protected at the state level. We're not there when it comes to the state of Kentucky. Now, when I talk about sexual orientation, when I talk about identity, I've got two statements here that acknowledge, and I think we all understand, we can go out into the world, meet family, meet friends, turn on different cable news networks, if you will, and you will see that people approach the topic of sexual orientation in particular differently. Some understand sexual orientation as an innate, physiologically and or genetically fixed, and what I mean by that is thus unchangeable, fixed piece of identity, much like height or handedness. I myself come at sexual orientation with this understanding. I can tell you that my experience as a gay man, my identity as a gay man feels as innate to me as the fact that I am, 5 feet 8 inches tall, that I'm right-handed. It's just a part of who I am. That is not the mindset, though, with which I was raised. It is not the mindset that my family had. Certainly not at the time when I came out of the closet as a 19-year-old freshman at the University of Georgia. Others would approach sexual orientation through a socio-political or a faith-based lens, whereby it is believed to be an aspect, a choice, if you will, that someone might make, and there you could make a comparison to maybe religion or smoking status. What I'm trying to show here is that depending on whichever of these two lanes someone, and there could be a third lane, these are two that I'm putting forward, whether we're looking at bullet point number 1 or bullet point number 2, sex, age, religion, and smoking status, those sorts of features are already protected at the federal level. But when it specifically comes to sexual orientation and gender identity, until the Supreme Court made a historic ruling, it was on June 15th of last year. Until last year, if you'd done a Google search, you would have found, could someone be fired for being gay? Could someone be fired for being trans? The answer would have been, well, it depends. It depends on the state that you're in. Kentucky is kind of a sort of, but not state, meaning that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll show you where we're at in Kentucky. Suffice it to say that this has been tricky. And I remember where I was on June 15th last year when my phone started to buzz and folks were letting me know, did you hear what the Supreme Court just ruled? So here's what happened. I'm going to walk you through where we've been, some of the twists and turns, and how this culminated and where we're at currently. This happened in June 15th of last summer. So going back to the Obama administration, the Obama administration had determined that, remember how when we saw a few slides ago, the different factors that go back to the 1964 Civil Rights Act? The Obama administration was holding that the sex clause covered sexual orientation and gender identity, and therefore LGBTQ folks were covered through the sex clause. That was the position of the Obama administration. The Trump administration disagreed with that and held that no, that is not what the sex clause means. So, you see there that this was inevitably heading towards a legal battle. In 2018, as we see, a federal court held that yes, we're going to take the Obama approach and say yes, that when we hear the term sex, which has been in the clause since 1964, that sexual orientation and gender identity are necessarily held underneath that term. Yet, if you understand the way the legal court works in the United States, this particular federal court only had jurisdiction over Connecticut, New York, and Vermont. So this, again, it creates a very complicated patchwork of where you live in the United States until, of course, this ultimately was brought before the Supreme Court, and it was, the ruling came down in June of last year that yes, the term sex in the Civil Rights Act does cover sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, this particular case had to do with employment discrimination. So where are we at now? In terms of employment discrimination, since the Supreme Court ruling, workers cannot be fired for being gay or transgender. I will acknowledge, and what I'm about to say, I am not a lawyer, but there are religious or faith-based exemptions sometimes to how these things work. So, and this kind of gets into a territory that we'll talk about in a moment. But by and large, unless we're dealing with an employer that is a faith-based, or for any other number of reasons, if there are exclusions on how they're able to navigate matters of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. With those exceptions in mind, workers now cannot be fired for being gay or transgender. And I mean, for me, this is a tremendous step forward. This is fantastic. Now, the ruling in 2020 strictly covered the Discrimination Act through the lens of workplace discrimination, hiring and firing. This does not speak yet to broader questions of housing, services, public accommodations, and what it would take to get that comprehensive coverage, wherein sexual orientation, gender identity are comprehensively covered. That would need to go through what's right now. It's recently been passed by the House. It's in the hands of the Senate, but it's called the Equality Act. We could have a whole workshop about the Equality Act. And so I'll just have to simply say here, the screenshot that I've included came from February of last year. The House has passed it. I don't know whether the Senate will pass it. I know that President Biden has certainly signaled that he wishes to sign the Equality Act. The Equality Act, y'all, would comprehensively cover sexual orientation and gender identity, not just for housing, I'm sorry, not just for employment, but for housing, for public accommodations, for all of this. Now, you've probably heard, there is tension here because, as I've acknowledged and I've seen it in my own life, the matter of sexual orientation and gender identity is often a point of debate, of contention, I'll say, with respect to matters of faith and religion. And you hear about instances wherein, for example, a same-sex couple might be turned away from a bakery if they go to order a wedding cake. And then you've got the owner of the bakery saying that for religious conviction reasons, he or she does not want to provide a cake to an LGBT person or couple. How that should be navigated, I've of course got my own opinions on the matter, but again, I don't want to digress. I simply want to say these matters are all at the heart of what the Equality Act will or won't address. And if you were to do a search of why do people support the Equality Act, what are the opinions of those who do not support the Equality Act, you'll often find that it's that there are tensions, perceived or otherwise, between religious liberty and sexual orientation, discrimination, protections. It's a very fraught subject. Again, it's a subject that I have been navigating my own life, my whole life with my own family. So read a book like Dr. Barton's in particular, if these are issues that you're dealing with your own family. All right, which brings me to this point. In my opinion, the socio-political, the cultural, the religious contexts, if you will, of what makes the United States of America factors into this conversation. This image comes from Gallup, a poll that they did in 2017 of states that are considered the most religious, and down to the least religious. We are in Kentucky. You've probably heard the term before, the Bible Belt, which often includes a swath of the South and into the Southwest portions of the United States. Now, in this next slide, I'm going to show you where the country was prior to the Supreme Court ruling when it came to workplace protections. Now, prior to the Supreme Court ruling, these gray states that we see here offered no protection to LGBT or trans workers. Do you see, and the dark blue, for example, offered the highest level of full protection. Do you see the correlation here between, here the dark green fairly overlays with the gray, here the navy more or less correlates with the light green. So there are socio-political factors here at play, which I'm simply trying to show you, that in my opinion do shape the way people come at this. Now, so where are we here in Kentucky? Well, prior to the Supreme Court ruling, as you see here, Kentucky fell into a category of states wherein sexual orientation and gender identity was protected from discrimination by virtue of a governor's executive order, which only was able to protect state employees. So prior to the Supreme Court ruling, state employees were protected in Kentucky. So let me kind of walk you through then where we've been here in the state of Kentucky. In 2003, then Governor Paul Patton put forth a governor's executive order protecting state employees. To my knowledge, again, I'm not a lawyer here, I'm simply a career advisor, but it is my understanding that I guess a governor's executive order can only do so much. But that went back to 2003. These protections were removed by the next governor, Governor Ernie Fletcher. Now, they were restored in 2008 when Steve Beshear, our current governor, Andy Beshear's father, Steve Beshear. So you see how it kind of was getting bounced back and forth depending on the governor and depending on the political affiliation perhaps of that governor. I will tell you that when Matt Bevin, our previous governor, was elected, then Governor Matt Bevin did not rescind Governor Steve Beshear's order, which means that it stayed in place. So from 2000 onward, that executive order was intact, was not removed by Beshear, was not touched either or removed by Andy Beshear when he took office, our current governor, Andy Beshear. So know that state employees were protected within Kentucky going back to 2008. Now that's all of Kentucky. But then, as some of you might know, this is where it continues to get even more complex. Laws can even actually be adjusted when we zoom in all the way to the county level, the county or the city level. And so here we see going back, I think all the way to 1999 and onward, we now have 21 Kentucky cities who have at the local level put in place non-discrimination ordinances. And these non-discrimination are often called fairness ordinances, cover housing, employment, and accommodation. So in effect, these are like hyper-local versions of the Equality Act. Does that make sense? So here within these cities, they've got an equality-like umbrella of protection at the city level. So what I'm trying to paint the picture here is that depending on the city, the state, what level of federal protections we have, you know, right now, thanks to the 2020 Supreme Court ruling, workplace discrimination is now a settled issue. Housing and public accommodations is not. So then we would now, as Kentuckians, would have to go back to the state level. And when it comes to issues like housing and public accommodation and services, the protections now currently only exist. We don't have a statewide anti-discrimination statement, and thus we rely on these 21 fairness ordinances. All right, and I've shown you a little bit of history. I mean, much like the governor's executive orders were kind of getting bounced back and forth, the city of Henderson would be an example of a city where they had it and then they didn't, and then they had it again. VICO, by the way, when they passed their fairness ordinance in 2013, the then population of VICO was 334. It was said to be the smallest city in the entire United States of America to have passed a fairness ordinance. So pretty remarkable history that we see here. So I want to bring this back now to where this leaves us for career conversations. You know, depending on those of you who are here in the room, I understand we are, I'm sure, a diverse mix right here within the sound of my voice. And those of you who go on to see me perhaps through a recorded video. What I would want to tell you, whether you are LGBTQ+, whether you're an ally, whoever you are, I feel like these conversations matter to all of us, whether we're a worker who's concerned about this for our own selves, or whether we're going to be a future HR coordinator one day, and we want to make sure that we are creating an equitable work environment, or maybe you're concerned about your friend or your brother or your sister. So these are some common questions that I have not only faced in my own career, but in my capacity as a career advisor, counseling students that I work with here at my institution. Prior to joining the University of Kentucky, I worked at Morehead State University in Eastern Kentucky. So I've been having these kinds of conversations with students for a number of years. And a common question would be, should I disclose my sexual orientation to an employer? There is no law, certainly, that says that you would have to do that. That relates then to when would be a good time, if I wanted to disclose my sexual orientation to an employer. This gets back to the very first slide that I showed you, where it truly is my opinion that this is a personal choice that is laden with whatever context you are in. Now, for me, when I go back to my early 20s, and I think about some of the institutions that I was working for at the time down in Georgia, my home state, in the early 2000s, I graduated from college in 2003. And the political landscape, the landscape of laws at the federal, the state, the local levels were wildly different back then, far fewer protections than any of us have right now in 2021. I remember realizing that if I were out on the job, that I could be fired. And so I remember, and I was in education, which in many respects is sometimes more of a conservative institution than perhaps going on to work in corporate America. And I'll say more about the corporate America Corporate Equality Index in a moment. But I have, in my own life, in my early 20s, I went through a period where I was out personally, but closeted in the workspace. And I can just tell you from my own experience that was a very difficult period in my life. One that I learned within just a few short years was one that was not going to be sustainable for me. So I actually, it was part of what informed me then moving on to different states. I briefly lived in Canada for a while. I lived in New England, specifically had chosen to move to Vermont with my now husband. He's originally from Kentucky, but by this point, he's also, by the way, in education. He's a K-12 public school teacher. A part of what informed our decision to move to Vermont was that we had found in our own separate ways that being closeted at work was not going to be emotionally sustainable for us. So we literally left the South in search of states where this was settled state law. We started moving back to Kentucky when we understood, the breadth of the government. The governor's orders. I'm digressing here a little bit. All I'm trying to say is that in my own life and in my husband's life, we have made lots of different decisions over the course of our 20s and 30s, and now I'm in my 40s. So I've been there and gone through all of this. The point I now want to try to tell you is, over the course of time, what I came to understand was that for me personally, it was important to be able to be completely out at work in ways that would be no different than I think, straight folks are out on the job. There might be a picture of someone's husband or wife, on the desk. You might simply mention, oh, do you have any plans this weekend? Oh, my wife and I are going to go see her parents. These kinds of conversations come up all the time where you just naturally realize that you're acknowledging your husband or your wife or your kids. And so it's in those everyday occurrences that our personal life becomes, known knowledge in our professional life. And I had found myself in my 20s, for fear of losing my job, becoming very compartmentalized. And again, for me, that was not anything that I found that was sustainable for me in the long term. I then made the choice somewhere along the way that the way that I would navigate this, the moment that I would be disclosing my sexual orientation to an employer, and this is a personal maneuver, a choice, if you will, that I use, is I acknowledge it in the interview. And what I mean by that is oftentimes in an interview, one of the first questions you'll get will be, "No, Josh, tell us about yourself," or "Josh, walk us through your resume." I might simply say something in passing as simple as, "Well, as you see, I worked in Vermont. My husband and I moved there in 2011. Did you catch that? I just casually would say, "My husband and I." You know, my husband and I moved to Vermont. My husband and I relocated to Moorhead, Kentucky. But I will just make this brief reference to the fact that I have a husband. And my personal thought on the matter is that I've just indirectly acknowledged to you that I'm a gay married man. If that is an issue for you, or such that you would not want to hire me, then I don't want to be hired by you, is kind of my philosophy on this. Now, granted, I also have made it a point of moving forward only wanting to be employed by an employer or in a county or in a state wherein there are protections. So luckily for me, even independent of any potential for interpersonal discrimination, which I could run up against, which I have in the past. Granted, I'm grateful to say that it's been instances that have been few and far between. But even if I know, all right, well, working for a public institution, I'm covered by the governor's protection, or I'm living in a county that has a fairness ordinance, or I'm working for a corporate company that does have protection. Those things matter to me. So I only put myself into a situation now professionally where I already know that my employer on paper has an inclusive discrimination policy. And yet, regardless of what the larger policy might be, I do want to go ahead. For me personally, it feels like a good psychological choice to go ahead and, hey, you haven't even hired me yet, and I've acknowledged to you that I'm a gay man. And I'm grateful to say that that's never once been an issue. So that is when I acknowledge and find ways to basically say I'm a gay person. I'm lucky in that regard because I'm married, so that it kind of allows me to, I can just kind of, throw it out that way. If I were single, I wouldn't necessarily be able to use that same turn of phrase, but that is the way that I've handled it. How do I know if an environment is safe? This gets down to what we in career advising call a company culture, or a work environment. So this is where I've always been very careful now to make sure that I'm paying close attention to what are the discrimination policies of this company, what are the discrimination policies of this district, of this organization. And so part of the way that we can do this is just by doing some research. And this actually ties into a philosophy that I carry with me in all of my career advising, not even, now stepping aside for a moment of stepping away from LGBTQ conversations. I, as a career advisor, tell students, when you're thinking about getting your future put together, whether it's what should I major in, what should I do with my major, where should I launch my life, what city should I live in, what state do I want to work in, all of these things are part of these larger conversations. What you're good at, what are you interested in, but what motivates you. We call these in career advising, we often will call these values or motivators, where we're motivated in different ways. And so to kind of tie this back to LGBTQ issues, some people are motivated to stay in their home state. Some people are motivated and would value the idea of, I want to move somewhere new. I want to move to LA or to Denver, Colorado, or a place I've never been. But for the LGBTQ person in particular, geography, for reasons that we looked at before, sometimes geography becomes a part of the conversation. What will the culture on the ground be in this city, in this state, in this county, or at this company? So all of this kind of ties together. And what I tell folks to do is to just try to get into alignment with what you see here. So I'm talking now both to just general career advising, big picture, but also for the LGBTQ student in particular, get in alignment. In my experience, I felt very much out of alignment when I realized I am working in a district at a school wherein there is not protection. And so what hastened our move to Vermont, I at the time was working at Morehead State University, which I'm grateful to report does have sexual orientation and gender identity as part of Morehead State's comprehensive discrimination policy. But my husband was working at the time for a district. This was before governor's orders had it covered. And so he, as a public school teacher, where we were in Kentucky was not covered. So that's part of why we left for Vermont. And by the time that we came back to Kentucky, governor's orders had changed the situation. Anyway, it's been a complicated ride. It's been in many ways difficult. I don't wish that for any of you, anyone here that's part of this workshop. I want your road ahead to be one that is fraught with less uncertainty. That's certainly my wish for anyone here. This brings me to a resource that I want to highlight. The Human Rights Campaign. You've probably seen these bumper stickers around on roads or on the interstate, but this is their logo. You'll often see it in the form of a bumper sticker around town. But the HRC is a nonprofit organization that fights for LGBTQ equality in every respect. One of the tools that they have developed is called the HRC Corporate Equality Index, and they update this every year. And y'all, what this does is it takes measure annually of private businesses, corporations in the United States, and they take stock of how they treat the LGBTQ community, their employees, their consumers, their partners, their investors, everything from healthcare policies to the way that they manage their advertising and everything in between. And it's a way to get a check on, I'm thinking about working for fill in the blank company. Where are they when it comes to LGBTQ inclusion? And the HRC Corporate Equality Index would be a great place to start, to sort of get your finger on the pulse of how does fill in the blank company treat their employees, treat the community. And this would be part of where I would encourage you to get into alignment with a company, with a brand that you value, and that is in sync with what your identity and what your values are. I think we as Americans, we as consumers understand brands. And if any of you are marketing students, you might hear folks talk about brand identity, or you might even hear a career advisor talk about, your personal brand. But brand, whether we're talking about a company or a product or even an individual, it's easy to imagine, like someone like Oprah has a brand, right? But you don't have to be Oprah or Michael Jordan to have a brand. We as individuals also have brands. But part of what comprises a brand does touch on matters of culture and values and behavior and the way that we communicate. I, for example, as an individual, when I tell students, who's someone whose brand that I really admire, I would say, RuPaul Charles is someone. If you know RuPaul, RuPaul is someone who I respect in every sense of the word for all of the reasons that I see here. This is part of Ru's brand, both as an individual, but also as an entertainer. But what I'm getting at here is that companies, organizations, your future employer is going to have a brand identity. And I encourage you as a future worker to get into alignment with a brand, with a company whose values reflect your own and who have your welfare in mind. RuPaul actually has a quote that kind of, I think, speaks to this topic. Ru says, unless they're paying your bills, pay them no mind. But watch what Ru did there. Ru's big picture philosophy is probably going to be, be you, live your life, and don't worry about what other people think. But he seems to have one exception. And of course, this is tongue in cheek, but I actually think there's some wisdom here, unless they're paying your bills. This is why this was such a complicated issue for me in my youth, is I needed a job. We all need jobs. You're getting your degree in large part because you want to be able to launch a life for yourself, and you want to launch a career for yourself, and who our employer is and the power that an employer has over our lives does matter. And so pay mind to my advice here, and what I think in effect what we can get from even this RuPaul quote is pay mind to the people with whom we do business as employees and as employers. That's a lesson that I've learned over the years. And as I mentioned, with time and with experience, I came to the conclusion that what was important for me was to only work for institutions, in my case, schools, school districts, universities, wherein I knew full well exactly what their policies were. And I also understood the ramifications of the geography where I was living. I, being someone who has done a lot of travel in many ways tied to this issue. I've gone to Canada, I've gone to Vermont, but ultimately I wanted to come back home because this is where my family is. It's where my husband's family is. But I came back only at a part where I understand now what the rules of engagement are at the local and federal level. So this is why I call this a complicated matrix, and it's changing. You know, as recently as this time last year, prior to the Supreme Court ruling, the world was already a very different place. The world when I say the world, I mean the United States here. Our world as Americans could be shifting depending on what happens with the Equality Act. So you know, all of these things, stay tuned. As I come to a conclusion here, I want to tell you that one of my guiding philosophies as a career advisor, actually here at UK in my office, it's one of our hashtags, which is hashtag what's your start date. What we mean by this in career advising is, you know, what's your start date when you thinking about your future? You know, when you as students at Center arrived for your first day, that was a major start date. When you take classes for your major and show you what the future world of work is going to be like, that's a start date. When you join a club or do an internship, any of those things are major start dates. When you start navigating, if we were to use the same philosophy, but thinking about matters of identity, when you start, you know, asking questions about, you know, how does LGBTQ experience impact your own life or people that are close to you, when you start having these conversations and making decisions about what is this going to mean for your future, that's a major start date. What I want for all of you is to feel more than anything else informed on this topic, but also if I could impart to you just some courage and some confidence, you know, maybe more than I had when I was your age. You know, so this has been a difficult road for me. You know, the things that I went through with my family when I was young, choices that I had to make in my 20s. About, I've got to find a place where I feel safe. I've got to find a place where I feel understood. And I simply want to say, if there's anyone here in this workshop who doesn't feel safe or doesn't feel understood, find people who can help you. Because I found the right kind of people in my own life that I could reach out to, and they helped me along the way. And they became enormous mentors, enormous safe spaces, if you will, for not only valuable and critical advice, but also just for support. And they helped me become, you know, the young man that I needed to be. And now, you know, as I grow older, I know where I stand. But with vulnerability and humility, I want to tell you that in my own life, it's not always been an easy road. So I hope for you that you feel well supported, that you feel hopeful about where you can go, and that's my wish for you. And I think that I speak on behalf of my friends at Center when I say that I think that that's what they want for you as well. I see some nods. So I will leave it there, and would be happy to chat with any of you. I think we've got a little bit of time left on the clock. So yeah, so that's my story. That's what I want to share with you all.
Do we have any questions? I know I have.
Will this
you go ahead, Vati. No, you're fine.
Oh, sorry.
You're
Will
fine.
this recording be uploaded somewhere?
Yes. Yes. We are going to upload it to our YouTube channel for students who were interested in seeing the video today but couldn't make it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Josh, I had a question. So you mentioned earlier how in the beginning of like an interview, you will mention, you'll kind of go ahead and mention like, you know, my husband and I, just to kind of go ahead and put it out there.
That's right.
Yeah. What do you suggest for students who aren't currently in a relationship, or, you know, is there another way that maybe you would suggest them kind of coming out in an interview?
Sure.
So that things are aligned. Yeah.
Yep, that's a good question. So first, I would encourage to that student, you know, do your homework on that company's policies, that organization's policies. Would be my first piece of advice. But even if, you know, yes, on paper, fill in the blank company has shown that they have a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy that does cover sexual orientation, gender identity, and so forth. That would be the ideal, and that would be to check for that number one. And yet, we also know that institutions are managed by people, and we hopefully want to be brought on board with a boss, with colleagues that are going to be part of an environment wherein we feel safe and respected, independent of what might already be on paper. So my advice to that individual, to that student, would be to potentially say, you know, in the opportunity, the end of an interview where you have opportunities for questions, you might simply say, you know, as a member of the LGBT community, I'm curious, comma, boom, 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 something like that. So you could theoretically acknowledge there as a member of the community. Or you might simply ask, you know, can you speak to company culture as it relates to ensuring an equitable space around, you know, race, age, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity. You can just simply put the question out there without acknowledging one way or the other the extent to which you're part of that community, but that you're simply wanting them to speak, you know, tell me about how does diversity and inclusion look here at this organization? You could simply say that. What sorts of diversity and inclusion work are you doing? Now, what that does is acknowledges, I think it makes it pretty clear that matters of diversity and inclusion matter to you. That's why you're asking the question, and you're opening for them the door to speak on that. And hopefully that opens the door wide enough for them to acknowledge, here's what diversity and inclusion looks like for us. Does that help? Does that kind of?
I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, you don't even have to, you don't have to come out as someone who's gay, lesbians, trans. You can simply make it clear, and I would encourage you to do so. Inclusive work environments matter to me. I would argue that they should matter to everyone. It doesn't matter whether or not, you know, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, you might hear people talk about intersectionality. You know, we all come at this in, you know, different ways. I'm not a person of color, but inclusion and respect and diversity on points of race and ethnicity matter to me. Just like I think that issues tied to sexual orientation and gender identity matter to straight and to cis folks. Do you see what I mean? So that's a way that you can say, hey, diversity and inclusion matters to me. Can you talk to me about how your organization navigates that? Boom, you have put the onus of responsibility on their shoulders to assure you that they are going to be a culture, a company, a vibe that you'd be proud of.
That's great. Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions for Josh?
Just want to thank you for your time, Josh. Very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. It's sincerely a pleasure for me to be here and be a part of this conversation. And I've, as I mentioned earlier, I've got KCDA friends and colleagues at Center, so you all are friends of mine then by extension. So it's a pleasure to join you.
We really appreciate it. This is a wonderful conversation.
Well, it's been an honor then to be invited, and thank you very much.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you so much.
Bye then. Like I said, this will go up on YouTube, so I'm excited for students to be able to see it. Students who, need to hear this and watch this video. I'm excited for them to be able to see it later on our YouTube channel, and hopefully it helps them. I'm sure it will. This was wonderful information.
Well, listen, and my thanks to you all as student success professionals. Thank you for opening up this conversation, because these are conversations, whether we're a student, whether we're faculty, whether we're staff, these kinds of conversations, I think, benefit all of us. And so thank you, folks at Center, for giving audience to this very topic.
Yeah. Well, great. All right. Well, I hope everybody enjoys this beautiful day. Thank you so much, Josh.
Wonderful. Thank you. Y'all take care.
Yeah.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.